Hello, thank you for joining us and welcome to the ESHA webinar going over the new nutrient calculator and going over converting nutrient units for the new 2016 nutrition regulations. Just before we get into all of that, we'll go over a few things beforehand. If you'd like some additional training with the Genesis application, we have a few coming up. We have an advanced Genesis workshop February 7th and 8th in Lombard, Illinois. We have the Genesis Professional Training in Washington, D.C. on March 23rd and 24th. And we have a Genesis Restaurants Training coming up in Illinois on March 27th and 28th. If you'd like to register for any of those, you can email training@esha.com or go to our website to find more information. We do have one more upcoming webinar after today, and of course we'll schedule more as it comes. It'll be on February 14th, Valentine's Day. And that'll be taking a closer look at the new FDA Dietary Fiber definition. So we'll delve as far into that as we possibly can, looking at the new Dietary Fiber regulation and how that impacts you. We've got a few existing webinars that you can take a look at. The three that you can see here are fantastic resources to look at for the new regulations. You've got 3 different parts. They're all between 30 and 45 minutes long each, and they go through how Genesis handles the new nutrition regulations and guidelines and labels, and how it can impact you and the new nutrients and everything that you need. A little bit about SEO Research. SEO was established in 1981 with the goal of providing a comprehensive nutrition database with few missing values. Our solutions include food formulation and labeling software, Genesis, restaurant labeling software as well, supplement formulation and labeling software, including our brand new Genesis Supplements application that was released last year, nutrition and diet analysis software, the food processor, and our consulting services. Today we'll take a look at some of the background on nutrient unit changes, some conversions. We'll go over an introduction to the nutrient calculator, doing some due diligence and documentation, and we'll take a little bit of Q&A. I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague Maya, who is going to go over everything that I just talked about.
Thank you, Ben, for that introduction. As Ben mentioned, today we're going to talk about the new nutrient calculator, which is part of Genesis and Food Processor. I wanted to give a little bit of background about some of the nutrient changes as well as the unit changes and sort of why we decided to go about and create this new function. So as a reminder, some of these slides might be familiar to some of you, but I wanted to mention things like vitamin A, vitamin E, folate, vitamin D. All of these nutrients have been affected by the changes. So let's dive a little deeper. For instance, vitamin A has gone from 5,000 international units to the new recommended daily intake would be 900 micrograms RAE, and that's retinol activity equivalents. Vitamin E has been changed from the 30 international units to 15 milligrams of alpha tocopherol. Folate and vitamin D has also been changed. So this is sort of what's driving the need for us to address unit changes and wanting to provide a solution for you. A couple more changes that have come about. There's also been changes to niacin from milligrams of niacin to milligrams of niacin equivalents. With all the unit changes, the daily recommended values have also been updated. So on the right here we have a screen showing some of the decreases that have occurred. Total carbohydrate is one of those, down from 300 to 275. The next 3 slides focus on the actual conversions going on behind the scenes in the nutrient calculator. Previously, these were required to be done by hand outside of Genesis. These slides will be available for download, and it's good to understand the math going on behind the calculations. Just like any tool, the AutoCalculator is a tool, but to be an avid user, we really must understand kind of the math behind it. So here are the conversions that are taking place. We've got vitamin D we're going to dive into, as that's one of the new mandatory nutrients. Niacin has been updated, as we've mentioned, and it actually involves tryptophan into the calculation now. Some of the other conversions taking place in the AutoCalculator Folate, we're going to be working through an example on. I did want to bring your attention to vitamin E. Sometimes in the AutoCalculator, we will be required to determine the source of where the nutrient is coming from. So vitamin E is one of those nutrients where we must determine whether it's coming from a natural or a synthetic source. And with that, the calculation will be different. The AutoCalculator will walk you through these questions. And lastly, here's another slide on the conversion where this is another one that really depends on the source. So vitamin A will have a different conversion whether it comes from an animal or a plant source. And we can also derive vitamin A information if we have retinol or carotenoid values for the food. So these are the conversions that are going on there. So the introduction of the nutrient calculator was from Genesis R&D and Food Processor in 11.2. If you don't see the nutrient calculator in your new system, you want to make sure you're up to date. So 11.2 is the most up-to-date version. You can contact our sales team, sales@esha.com, to get the most up-to-date version. The nutrient calculator itself calculates the following nutrients. So carbohydrates, the new dietary fiber fields, vitamin A, vitamin B3, vitamin D, vitamin E, niacin equivalents, folate and folic acid, as well as tryptophan. There is an asterisk next to dietary fiber because, as always, special consideration is needed when dealing with the new dietary fiber definition. So let's talk a little bit about how some of the calculations will work, and then I'll show you what actually in Genesis itself. So some of the calculations are more straightforward. So here we have vitamin D, where we simply take the international units for vitamin D and divide it by 40, and that's going to give us the vitamin D micrograms, which are now required to show on our label. This would what it look like in Genesis. If we open it up, we would see before the calculation, we would have a value in for vitamin D IUs, and this would be a blank field, the micrograms vitamin D. After the calculation process, you see that we've taken 100 divided by 40, and the program will populate 2.5 for vitamin D micrograms. So that's a pretty straightforward calculation that's going on there. Some of the calculations in the AutoCalculator require you to answer questions about your food. So you really must know the types of ingredients you're working with. We really want to be, I'll repeat this a few times, an active participant in this process. So take it upon yourselves to understand the types of ingredients you're working with. In this scenario, when we go to calculate vitamin A, RAE, we will be asked by the system if it is an animal or a plant source. And again, as we just saw, each one of those will have a different calculation that's going on behind the scenes. Some calculations require thorough knowledge about your ingredients, specifically dietary fiber. So due diligence requires that you understand beneficial versus non-beneficial fiber. As a reminder, in order for dietary fiber to show on the new panel, there must be scientific evidence of beneficial physiological effects to human health. This includes naturally occurring fibers and added fibers, which could be isolated or synthetic, that have been determined to be beneficial. Some examples of the naturally occurring fiber things that are intrinsic, such as fibers in vegetables, whole grains, fruits, cereal bran, things like that. We have intrinsic, naturally occurring fibers. Those are automatically considered beneficial. And then the other list, was something you'd see here, is this is the current list of the 7 approved isolated and synthetic dietary fibers. So I'm giving you this background because it is important when we walk through the auto calculation for dietary fiber in Genesis that we do have an understanding of what counts as beneficial versus non-beneficial fiber. This is a list that is still in review. So currently there is a literature review going on, and we're hoping to get some more determination as to whether or not these types of ingredients would count as beneficial fiber. So if you're working with something on this list, the reality is we just don't know yet. If that's the case, you may want to wait to make the transition over to the new label until you really have stronger direction on how to handle these. So let's talk a little bit about how the AutoCalculator is calculating the dietary fiber in Genesis. So up at the top I have the formulation listed. Basically what's going on is it's going to take the total dietary fiber, which is this field here. That is the field that will pull forward to the old label. Remember that this field never required us to have a beneficial versus non-beneficial decision-making process. We simply would look at our spec sheet, and that's the total dietary fiber. What the calculation is doing is taking that number and subtracting any other fiber. So these fields down here where I have other fiber 2016 is going to be subtracted from the total fiber to give us the dietary fiber 2016. Keep in mind, however, that any missing nutrient values will be set to 0 if used in a calculation. That means that if you're missing information in these other fiber fields, we could inaccurately match the total dietary fiber to the dietary fiber 2016. Be an active participant in the process. If you don't know if you have other fiber in your food, you may not want to go forward with using the auto calculation until you feel confident that you can populate these fields with a 0 before the system assumes that it is a 0. So with that, I will hop over into Genesis and we can show you a little bit about how we walk through the auto calculator. So the auto calculator can be used in both food processor and Genesis for ingredients. So I'm going to go ahead and start to create a new ingredient. I would just go up to the top toolbar and say New Ingredient. Here I would fill out the first 3 fields. I would put a name, so I'm going to put in some chopped almonds here as my ingredient. The quantity I'm pulling from my spec sheet, which is a 100 gram unrounded, and that's all I'm going to put on this first field. I will then hop over to the nutrients. Right now I'm going to focus on entering in the nutrients. So once you get to this field, you might notice, those that have been working in Genesis for a while, when you get this new version, you're going to notice it looks a little bit different here. First off, at the bottom, notice that auto calculations is a new feature and it has a little box next to it. If I click that, what shows up in blue is all of the nutrients that we are able to make an auto calculation on. So that's the first sort of difference we'll notice here. We can go forward with entering in our information. So I'm just pulling this right off of my spec sheet, go for the protein, enter in my carbohydrates. When that happens, the system is actually pulling up our first sort of decision making. It's asking, would you like to calculate a nutrient? And the nutrients that it's offering me are carbohydrate available, which is actually mainly used in the EU, and total dietary fiber. Since I'm not concerned with carbohydrate available and I already have information on dietary fiber from my spec sheet, I'm going to say no at this point in time and continue moving on. Here I go to my total dietary fiber and I'll enter in the information that I have, which is 5. At that point, I'm then again asked if I'd like to calculate a nutrient. In this case, the next nutrient that I'm really concerned about is this dietary fiber 2016. So determining whether or not this nut is considered beneficial. Remember from what we just discovered in our PowerPoint that any missing values will be set to 0 if used in a calculation. So you'll remember, and you can see down here, I'm actually missing values for my other fiber. However, I'm going to think through the process that we just talked about, and do I feel okay with the system automatically populating these as zeros in the other fiber field? And I do, yes, because I know that this is a nut. It doesn't contain anything that is driving me to think otherwise. I would confirm this with my spec sheet, confirm with my supplier, and if I feel confident in that, and only when I do, I can go ahead and move forward with this calculation. So at this point, I'm going to click the top formula here, because I'm interested in calculating specifically the dietary beneficial 2016 fiber. I click on that. It's going to continue to ask me if I'd like to calculate any other nutrients. At this point, I'm going to say no. And when you see what has happened now is the program has automatically populated the other fiber with a 0, and it has matched the dietary fiber 2016 with the total dietary fiber. Again, you probably want to, once you go through that calculation, ask yourself, does that make sense? Is this the answer that I'm expecting to see? In this case, it certainly is. I feel confident I'm going to keep moving forward. So I would continue to enter in my information. For the sake of moving forward, I'm going to focus on those with the auto calculation. So here, let's say I had some information on vitamin A in international units. So I would look at my spec sheet, and I would go ahead and populate this with the international units. Once I do that and I simply either click down to the next box or use the arrow, again, the system will ask me, would you like to calculate a nutrient? In this case, it's asking me, would you like to calculate vitamin A retinol activity equivalence, which is declared in micrograms? And if so, you need to identify whether it is an animal or a plant source. I'll go ahead and say this is a plant source, and automatically the system has made that calculation for us. And now continue on, perhaps focusing on something like vitamin D. So vitamin D is a new mandatory nutrient that must be declared in micrograms. You may have some information that comes forward in international units, so that sort of the same thing would hold true here. Whatever we populated for international units, the system will ask me if I want to make that simple conversion, which we first looked at, which is really just a matter of division. So you can see as I continue to populate the information, that's how Genesis will prompt you to ask if you'd like to transition certain or calculations. If you wouldn't like to deal with this, or perhaps enter in all your information at the beginning and then go back and do an auto calculation, you can always just unclick this box and enter it in as we always would have. So it's still good practice to do it this way and really understand, work through how you would assume certain things to be populated, and then maybe confirm that with the auto calculations. Again, please be an active participant in this process. Next, I'm going to turn to this scenario where imagine you've been working in Genesis for some time, which I'm sure many of you have, and you may have hundreds and hundreds of ingredients that have been pre-populated. With all of these new changes on the new label regulations, you're probably currently working through making some of those transitions over into the new nutrients. So I'm going to open up something that I've already created. So this is just like anyone else that, we have some information on this apple. This is an ingredient that's been in our system for some time, but I want to work through and see if the auto calculator can help me transition this ingredient over to be ready for the new label. So again, I open up my ingredient just like always. I'll go to the Nutrients tab on the left-hand side, and right off the bat I can see that I certainly am missing some information. I can turn on my auto calculator, of course, and I will go ahead and click on the Dietary Fiber 2016. I'll hit the box down here which says Calculate Nutrients. So below this auto calculation box, there's another box that says Calculate Nutrients. When I hit on that, what I'm shown is basically every single nutrient and its formula that we are able to make a calculation on. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to start one by one at first rather than just clicking willy-nilly through all of these. Again, I really want to understand and go slowly, make sure that everything's making sense. So I'll start with the first one, which will be dietary fiber. I'll click this box here. When I do that, you'll notice a couple other boxes have been grayed out. That means that these two other fields are involved in this formula, and so if I want to calculate total dietary fiber 2016, I'm no longer able to calculate the total dietary fiber or the other fiber because those are the two functions that are involved in getting us the number that we need. I'll go ahead and hit calculate. Also, as a reminder, this missing nutrient values will be set to 0 if used in a calculation. Really important to remember that that will always remain true. And so you want to confirm that if that's going to happen, you do in fact want zeros where those will be populated. So I'll hit calculate. And automatically what has occurred is the other fiber has been populated to 0 and the dietary fiber 2016 has been matched with the total dietary fiber. Again, I want to ask myself, does this make sense? This is an apple. I know there's nothing strange going on with this apple or additional ingredients, but I always want to ask my supplier if I'm unsure and check my spec sheet. So yes, I feel comfortable that this calculation that we have just performed is valid, and I will move forward to the next one. Next, we can go down and we see that we do have information populated for vitamin A, IU, and again, maybe we'd like to transition that over to be able to put it voluntarily in RAE micrograms on our label. So I'll choose Calculate Nutrients again and go over to find vitamin A on this left-hand side, which is right here. I'll highlight that one and choose Calculate. Again, it will ask me to identify the source, plant or animal. This is, of course, a plant source. So I'll go ahead with that, and we can then see how vitamin A has been converted from the original unit. Lastly, we might focus on something like vitamin D. It looks like we're actually missing that information. So, of course, if you are missing vitamin D IU information, we won't be able to make the transition from to micrograms. So always make sure to, if you need that information, ask your supplier for vitamin D IUs or if they have it in vitamin D micrograms. So remember that we can only make the conversions when we have information to work with. The last one I might focus on is folate. So as we get down here, you'll notice there are actually 4 fields having to do with folate. A little bit of background information. So folate is a voluntary nutrient whose label unit has been changed from micrograms to microgram DFE, which is dietary folate equivalents. Folate is the natural form and folic acid is the synthetic form. So in this scenario, I might want to enter in a bit more information on my own and then try the AutoCalculator. So I'm actually going to turn off the AutoCalculator for now and just focus on these folates fields. I can see I'm getting 3 micrograms of folate, which is coming from my apple. Folic acid, as I mentioned, is a synthetic form of it, which I know we don't have, so I'm going to put a 0 there as a good practice, saying that there are 0 micrograms of folic acid being fortified in this apple. What's really going to show up on the label is going to be this field here, so the folate DFE microgram DFE. That is, if we voluntarily choose to put folate on our label, this is the field that will show up, meaning this is the one we need to populate. The last field down here, folate food micrograms, has to do with how much folate we're actually getting from the food. In this case, 1 microgram folate food equals the folate microgram up above. So I've got 3 micrograms here and 3 micrograms down below. Once I've done that, now I'm able to use the AutoCalculator to attain the information that I need. So I'll go back and click back on the AutoCalculator, hit Calculate Nutrients, and I'm going to go down to find my folate DFE. I'm going to highlight that, say yes, I'd like to calculate that, please. Then when I go back to look at my folate information, you'll notice that the field that will show on the label has been populated with a 3, meaning we're getting 3 grams of folate from the apple. We have no synthetic forms of folic acid being added. So in that scenario, you may want to turn off auto calculations, try and enter in as much information as you can, and then go back and turn on the auto calculations to complete the process. In Genesis, we can also use the AutoCalculator on the recipe screen. So this will actually override nutrition information. I would suggest best practice would be doing it from the ingredient screen and making sure that you're ready to make the transition. As with any scenario when looking at a recipe, you may choose to look at your spreadsheet report. So I would say, if I opened up a recipe, the first thing I might want to understand is if I have any missing values. I can go over to the Reports tab and check out my spreadsheet report. I have it set to the mandatory 2016 fields here. You'll notice that I am missing some information. So keep in mind that if you're going to use the AutoCalculator on the recipe screen, which would be in the same area in the nutrients page, you want to make sure that you aren't missing information and that you feel you have a very good reason to put any sort of override nutrition in that information. With that, I'm going to hop back over to my PowerPoint and talk a little bit about documentation. So as a prudent manufacturer, documentation is and has always been a great standard. It seems to be even more important with all of the new changes from the label transition that's been going on. Examples of documentation have been nutrient databases, recipes of formulation, batch records. We also suggest documenting when you're reaching out to your suppliers. So if you've already reached out a few times, document that when you did that and what information you asked for. The more we can be kind of consistent and document that we're doing the best we can, we're doing our due diligence. The documentation is specifically important when a test is not available to decipher the sources. So when we have beneficial versus non-beneficial dietary fiber or a combination, when we have total versus added sugar or a combination, when we have naturally occurring folate and synthetic folic acid, and again when we have two forms of vitamin E. Especially in these scenarios, we really need to document what's going into our food and how we're keeping track of how we're classifying this information. If you feel like you're not quite ready to make the transition to the new label, if you go to look at your spreadsheet report and you still have lots of missing values and you're not able to attain, maybe we're still waiting on some guidance, maybe the suppliers aren't quite ready, it might be a good idea to just wait until we get to that point. As we mentioned, document every time you contact your suppliers. Do your best to stay consistent in your approach and keep abreast of the new FDA guidance to come, which we're hoping to see more soon. And as always, ESHA Consulting Services are here to help you should you be ready to make this transition and you need a little guidance. I think at that point, we'll hand it off to Ben. Ben, do you have any questions that have come in for us?
Yeah, absolutely. We will go into a couple of questions. Excuse me. If you'd like to contact us at any time, we have our information on this page here. You can give us a call or email our sales team. You can also join our LinkedIn page, view any of our blogs, or subscribe to our e-newsletter. And I just wanted to mention that this webinar is recorded. It will be posted on our website and on YouTube probably later today. And then the slides will be made available via email as well. We'll go into some of those questions that we've got. The first one, how do I see the new label nutrients on my spreadsheet report?
Sure. I kind of glossed over that, so that's a good question. So once we have our recipe open, so we just open up my sample fruit salad again. The important thing that we want to maybe first talk about is called Nutrients to View. So under my home page, they have an area here called Nutrients to View. From the drop-down menu, you'll see a list which comes with Genesis, which comes when you purchase Genesis, of multiple different types of listing. The idea here is that this will drive what shows on the reports. So we're going to use our spreadsheet report, but we also want to make sure we have the correct Nutrients to View highlighted. So the one that would specifically be geared towards the new nutrients would be this US label 2016 mandatory. So that's going to show you all of the mandatory nutrients that are on the labels. So once I have that highlighted, on my reports tab I can choose spreadsheet, and that's how you'll see automatically I see FIB 16, SUG add, SUG add, so that means we're definitely viewing new nutrients, vitamin D and potassium. You can also always change the nutrients to view. You can modify it to however you'd like. So back in our Nutrients to View page, I can go to Modify. From here I could edit this or start a brand new list. So if I choose New, I'll simply highlight the items that I'd like to add, click them over, and then I would save as with a different name that made sense to this list. So that's basically the process. Nutrients to View need to be set to your desired nutrients or the 2016 mandatory, and then we look at the spreadsheet report.
All right, our second question here, which is one I think we've seen a few times. Why is there no added sugar in the calculator?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, added sugar is sort of the fourth big ticket item. There's sort of a couple reasons. If you think of it from a mathematical perspective, there has to be 3 fields in which we can pull to make a formula. When we're working with added sugar, we really only have total sugar and added sugar. So right off the bat, we're not given 3 fields to sort of make a mathematical calculation with. Beyond that, sort of the more important reason is that added sugar really involves additional pieces of information that must be determined by your supplier or by your organization. So because Genesis is not going to know whether or not your sugar is naturally occurring or is being added, it's up to the user to make that determination. So that's why there's no added sugar auto calculation.
Great, thank you, Maya. We had another question come up that brought up the topic of rounding. We had somebody that was asking why a number was specifically rounding to 4 instead of 3 when it showed 3.5 in the spreadsheet. We believe that would most likely be just due to rounding. Maybe it's 3.4955, something like that. If you'd like to change the number of decimal places that you are showing in your spreadsheet report, you can go to the Home tab and Preferences. And under the General tab, Maya's gonna show it now. Home, Preferences, there we go. And then under the decimal places area, right here you have the option to select up to 6 decimal places. So the default is going to be 2, but you can show all the way up to 6. All right. Our next question: why doesn't vitamin E alpha tocopherol equivalent transfer to the new label?
Yeah, I could see why that'd be a question, because we do actually have a couple fields when it comes to vitamin E. The main reason is just that vitamin E alpha tocopherol equivalent is not an approved label nutrient. So what we'll actually show would be the vitamin E alpha tocopherol in milligrams. I mean, I can show you how to go about getting that on your label. So I'll just kind of stick with this fruit salad that we have open. If we wanted to show the voluntary vitamin E nutrient on our label, we would go to the Recipe tab. Under Edit Label is where we'll kind of start. Originally, under the General screen, we want to make sure that we have the category set to Nutrition Facts. That's important because vitamin E, different nutrients are going to be available whether or not we're working in the old label or the new label. So once we've got that set, we'll go down to the 4th option here, which is voluntary nutrients. And here I can choose down at the bottom to show vitamin E alpha toco. I'll choose OK, and then when I go ahead and view my label, you can see that it's actually been added here to the bottom. So the reason for that is that it's just not an approved label nutrient.
Perfect. Thank you, Maya. We got a couple more questions. One, can you show again where the previous versus new, the 1990 versus 2016 FDA label nutrients are shown? I believe we wanted to take a quick look one more time at the nutrients to view.
Sure. Yeah. So again, reports. We've got our spreadsheet report kind of open, and we can do this before or after. It doesn't really matter the order, but the other important piece would be under our Home tab. We go to Nutrients to View, and that's where we either choose, we can choose from any of this list. So if we wanted to see the old label nutrients, we would do US label mandatory. You can see automatically now we see vitamin A and vitamin C. We don't have any mention of that dietary fiber or added sugar. And it's just really simple to switch it right back and forth. So if you wanted to take a glance at the US label 2016 mandatory, we just switch back there.
Perfect. Thank you, Maya. I think we have one last question here. For documentation purposes, does every ingredient need a value, even if it is a 0, for every mandatory nutrient? For example, if there is an ingredient that logically has no protein, like sea salt, but there is no value, does the supplier need to verify that that is actually a 0, or is it reasonable to assume that it's a 0?
I don't tend to like to assume much. I would prefer to have that come from the supplier in a full and complete document.
That's certainly fair. Thank you for joining us today. If you have any additional questions or if we didn't get to your questions, we'll certainly get to them individually offline. Please join us for our next webinar, and everyone have a great day.